He moved into the wilderness to start over. Silence, forest, and solitude. But one discovery changes everything. A secret worth extreme measures. Watch till the end, subscribe, and like the video. Jack Hartman had imagined silence would feel different. After leaving the army, after the endless noise of engines, radios, and distant explosions, he thought quiet would be comforting. Instead, when he stood on the porch of the old house he had just bought in rural Montana, the stillness pressed against him almost as hard as the chaos he had left behind. The forest stretched in every direction, dark pines and uneven ground rolling toward a protected wildlife reserve a few miles away. This was exactly what he had wanted. Distance from people, from memories, from the life that had burned him out. The house itself was simple and worn but solid. 2 stories, weathered wood, a creaking porch, and windows that looked out into nothing but trees. Jack had bought it cheaply, paying in full with savings he had guarded carefully during his last years of service. There was no family following him here, no job waiting. Just land, isolation, and the hope that time would finally slow down. The nearest town was small, barely more than a main street with a gas station, a grocery store, and a diner where everyone seemed to know each other. When Jack first arrived to sign the final papers and buy supplies, conversations stopped when he walked in. No hostility, just curiosity mixed with caution. He noticed the way eyes lingered on him a second longer than necessary. A few people nodded politely. One older man asked where he was from. When Jack answered simply, "Out of state," the man smiled thinly and changed the subject. It was clear newcomers were rare, and questions were not asked without reason. Days passed quietly. Jack unpacked, fixed broken steps, patched the roof, and cleared brush around the house. At night, he slept better than he had in years, though his dreams were still restless. During the day, he explored the surrounding land, following deer trails and old fence lines half swallowed by the forest. The reserve nearby was clearly marked on maps, but on the ground the boundaries were harder to see. Nature did not respect signs. It was during these walks that Jack began noticing things that did not fit. Deep tire tracks cut through mud far from any maintained road. Not the kind left by park rangers or local farmers, but wide, heavy impressions from expensive off-road vehicles. Sometimes he heard distant gunshots late at night, sharp and brief, carried on the wind. Hunting season did not explain it, and the direction always seemed wrong, too close to protected land. Once, high above the trees, he saw a helicopter pass silently, unmarked, moving low and fast before disappearing beyond the hills. Jack did not jump to conclusions. Years in uniform had taught him not to assume without evidence. Still, unease followed him back to the house after each walk. The forest felt less empty than it should have been. One afternoon, several weeks after his arrival, Jack followed a narrow trail that curved away from the usual paths. Fallen leaves hid it well, but his eye caught the subtle signs of repeated use. The trail led deeper into the woods, where the trees grew thicker and the light dimmed. That was when he saw it. A structure half buried into the hillside, covered with branches, dirt, and camouflage netting faded by weather. From a distance, it looked like nothing more than a shadowed slope, but up close the edges were too straight, too deliberate. Jack crouched and examined it carefully. A reinforced metal door was set into the earth, its surface scratched and worn. No markings. No signs warning people away. Whoever had built it wanted it hidden, not protected by law, but by secrecy. After a long moment, Jack opened the door. Inside, the bunker smelled of oil, damp metal, and stale air. A small generator sat against one wall, silent but functional. Shelves lined the interior, holding boxes, old backpacks, and sealed containers. He found memory cards, flash drives, and 2 digital cameras wrapped in cloth. There was also a notebook filled with dates, numbers, and brief handwritten notes that meant nothing to him at first glance. Jack took everything outside, sitting on a fallen log as he powered up one of the cameras. The images made his stomach tighten. Photographs showed dead animals posed grotesquely: elk, wolves, even species clearly protected by law. In many pictures, smiling men stood beside their kills, faces partially shadowed but clothing unmistakably expensive. Custom rifles, luxury watches, private helicopters in the background. The cruelty was not accidental or desperate. It was deliberate, almost ceremonial. The videos were worse. Footage showed animals driven toward shooters, frightened and injured, while laughter echoed behind the camera. Jack shut the device off, his hands shaking slightly despite his effort to stay calm. He had seen violence before, but this was different. This was done for pleasure. It became clear that the bunker was not abandoned. It was a storage site, a place to hide evidence between visits. The notes in the notebook began to make more sense now. Dates aligned with the footage, numbers likely tied to payments or participants. Everything pointed to organized, ongoing illegal hunts operating right beside the reserve. Jack packed the devices carefully and returned to his house before dark. He considered calling the police immediately, but hesitation stopped him. If something like this had been happening for a long time, someone local might already be involved or afraid to speak. He did not yet know who he could trust. That night, sleep did not come easily. The forest outside seemed alive with sound, every branch snapping too loudly, every gust of wind carrying imagined movement. Jack lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the images in his mind. He knew one thing for certain. Whatever was happening out there was protected by money and silence. By morning, his decision was made. He would not confront anyone yet. He would observe, document, and understand the pattern before acting. The soldier in him recognized the terrain, not of land, but of risk. If he moved too fast without knowing who was watching, he could disappear just as quietly as the animals in those images. As he stepped outside and looked toward the forest, Jack felt the calm he had come here seeking slip further away. In its place grew something sharper and more focused. He had come to Montana to escape his past, but the land had placed something else in front of him, and whether he wanted it or not, he was already involved. Jack kept the bunker's contents hidden inside his house, sealed in a toolbox he could lock and move quickly if he needed to. He did not tell anyone in town what he had found. For the next several days, he forced himself back into routine repairs, supplies, short walks, while quietly shifting his attention to the patterns around the forest. He started writing down what he noticed the way he had learned to do in uniform: time, direction, details that might seem meaningless until they formed a picture. He began with the roads. From his property, a narrow stretch of gravel ran toward town, and a rougher track cut the other way along the tree line before vanishing into the wilderness. Jack drove those routes in daylight, learning where the ground held fresh mud and where tire marks stood out. The tracks he'd seen before were not random. They appeared in the same places, clustered near shallow dips and hidden turns, spots where vehicles could leave the road without being seen from a distance. At night, he listened. Twice he heard distant shots, each time separated by long stretches of silence. They were not careless bursts. They sounded controlled, spaced with intent. On one of those nights, he saw headlights far away, moving slowly, and then stopping where there was no visible driveway. When the lights went dark, the forest swallowed everything. Jack started walking with more purpose, staying on the edges of familiar paths and watching the ground for clues. He found boot prints near the places where the off-road tracks left the road, heavy tread patterns, multiple sizes, and always headed toward deeper forest. He also found small scraps of plastic and torn packaging that didn't belong in untouched land. Nothing dramatic, but enough to confirm that people were using the area regularly and didn't care about leaving traces behind. He marked times when he saw or heard anything unusual, and soon a rhythm emerged: late evenings, certain days of the week, moments when the forest seemed to hold its breath. The helicopter appeared again one afternoon, low and quiet, passing beyond the hills toward the reserve. It didn't circle or hover, it moved as if it already knew where it was going. Jack's suspicion hardened into certainty. The men in those photographs were not visiting once a year for a private thrill. This was organized, scheduled, protected. He decided he needed more than what he had already found. He needed proof tied to a location, something that could not be dismissed as old footage or someone else's property. He also needed to know how they entered the area. The reserve had marked boundaries on maps, but the forest itself was too open, too wide. If they were doing this without being stopped, they had routes that avoided attention. One evening, just after sunset, Jack sat in his truck a mile from his house with the engine off and the windows cracked. The air smelled of pine and cold soil. He waited until he saw what he had been expecting. Faint light moving between trees far down the gravel road. Vehicles. More than one. They did not drive with the casual speed of locals heading home. They moved slowly, cautiously, like people trying to avoid being noticed. Jack stayed still until the vehicles passed his position, then started his engine and followed at a distance, keeping his headlights off whenever he could. The road curved and dipped, and soon the vehicles turned onto a rough track that looked like nothing more than a break in brush. Jack stopped before the turn, parked behind a cluster of trees, and continued on foot. He moved quietly, stepping where the ground was firm, avoiding loose branches. The trail was narrow but clear now that he was on it, cut by repeated use. It led deeper into the woods, and after a while he saw the first sign that he was close. A faint glow flickering through the trees. He crouched behind a fallen log and watched. Through gaps in branches, Jack saw a camp set up in a clearing. There were several vehicles parked in a semicircle, the shapes large and expensive, built for power rather than necessity. Portable lights illuminated the area, but they were angled down as if designed to keep light from spilling too far into the forest. A few men stood apart from the main group, wearing dark clothing and carrying rifles slung across their chests. They moved like security alert without looking nervous, scanning the trees in slow, practiced sweeps. Closer to the center of the clearing, other men arrived, stepping out of the vehicles with an ease that spoke of wealth and entitlement. Their clothes were clean and fitted, their gear high-end. They were not tired from travel. They looked entertained, excited, like this was a weekend event arranged for their pleasure. Jack could not hear every word, but he caught laughter, the occasional sharp tone of instruction, and the metallic click of weapons being checked. Jack's jaw tightened. He remembered the images from the bunker smiles beside bodies, trophies displayed like prizes. This was the same group, the same kind of ritual. The camp was not temporary. It was prepared. He lifted his phone and began taking pictures, careful to keep it steady and low. The images captured the vehicles, the lights, the armed security, and the outlines of the men near the center. It wasn't perfect distance, and darkness made faces hard to see, but it was enough to establish the scene. He took a short video as well, focusing on the way the guards were positioned around the clearing. Then movement drew his attention beyond the camp. Lights flared in a different direction, and Jack saw something he hadn't expected. A line of people further out, pushing through brush, forcing something ahead of them. At first he couldn't tell what it was, but then he saw the shape, a large animal, panicked, stumbling, driven by shouting and noise. It tried to veer away and was forced back by men cutting it off. The animal's terror was visible even from a distance, the way it fought to escape and couldn't. The men near the center raised their rifles with casual readiness. There was no talk of tracking, no patience, no respect. This was not hunting. This was slaughter, arranged like a performance. Jack recorded again, his breath shallow. The animal broke toward the darker edge of the clearing, and for a moment it looked as if it might escape into the trees. Then a shot cracked through the air. The animal dropped, and the clearing erupted in laughter and applause. Jack felt a flash of heat in his chest, anger so sharp it made him clench his teeth. He kept filming, forcing himself not to move, not to react. He needed evidence. He needed enough that no one could brush this aside as rumor. As he shifted his weight slightly to steady his phone, his boot pressed down on a patch of dead wood hidden beneath leaves. The branch snapped with a sharp, dry crack. For an instant, nothing happened. Then one of the guards turned his head toward the sound, body tightening. Another guard followed his gaze, raising a hand in a silent signal. The camp's casual mood shifted. Men stopped laughing. Rifles angled outward. Jack froze, holding his breath, but it was too late. A flashlight beam swept across the tree line, cutting through shadows. It moved once, twice, then paused. The beam landed on Jack's position, reflecting faintly off his phone screen. "Hey!" a voice shouted. Jack pushed backward, trying to retreat silently, but the flashlight kept tracking him. He turned and ran, staying low, weaving between trees. Behind him, boots pounded the ground, fast and coordinated. These were not drunk amateurs. They moved with purpose. Jack tried to angle toward thicker brush, toward terrain that could slow them, but the guards had spread out. He caught a glimpse of dark shapes cutting him off from the side, forcing him toward a more open path. A hand grabbed his shoulder hard. He twisted, swinging an elbow, but another man slammed into him from behind. The impact drove him to the ground, knocking the air out of his lungs. He fought on instinct, trying to roll, trying to regain footing, but a knee pressed into his back and a fist struck the side of his head. Stars burst in his vision. Someone wrenched his arms behind him, forcing them together. Plastic restraints bit into his wrists. "Easy," a guard said close to his ear, voice cold. "Don't make this worse." Jack's breathing came in short, controlled pulls. He tried to focus, tried to read faces, but the flashlights blinded him. He heard the camp behind them, voices rising, excited now for a different reason. They dragged him back toward the clearing. As he was forced into the light, he saw the men he had been filming step forward, curiosity on their faces turning into irritation. One of them looked Jack up and down, eyes narrowing as if measuring what kind of problem he was. "This isn't some lost hiker," one of the guards said. "He was recording." The mood changed again. The laughter vanished. The men exchanged looks that carried an ugly understanding. Jack lifted his head despite the pain and tried to keep his voice steady. "You're in a reserve," he said. "This is illegal." A man in expensive gear stepped closer, expression flat. "You're a long way from help," he replied. Another guard reached into Jack's pocket and pulled out his phone. He glanced at the screen, then handed it to one of the hunters. The man scrolled briefly, face hardening. "He has enough," the man said. Jack felt the clearing tilt slightly, his head still ringing from the blow. He forced himself to stay conscious, to keep watching, to remember details, vehicles, faces, voices, anything he could hold on to. The guards tightened their grip and pulled him away from the lights, back toward the darkness of the woods. Jack stumbled as they forced him forward, wrists bound, balance gone. The camp's sounds faded behind him, replaced by the harsh rhythm of boots and the low murmur of men deciding what to do with a witness. As the forest swallowed the clearing, Jack understood the mistake he had made. He had come too close, too soon, without knowing exactly how far their control reached. And now, with his hands tied and the night closing in, he could feel the edge of something dangerous forming ahead, an outcome they had planned for people who saw what they weren't meant to see. Jack lost track of time somewhere between being dragged through the trees and being thrown onto the wooden floor. When his senses settled enough for him to understand where he was, cold pain spread through his body in slow, deliberate waves. His wrists were bound tightly behind his back, cutting circulation and sending sharp needles of numbness down into his fingers. His head throbbed with every heartbeat, and the air smelled of damp wood, mold, and old smoke. He lay still, forcing himself not to panic. Panic wasted energy, and energy was something he could not afford to lose. The room around him was small and dark. Faint moonlight slipped through narrow gaps between warped wooden planks. The place was an old hunting cabin, barely more than a box with a roof, abandoned long enough for nature to start reclaiming it. There was no furniture except a broken chair in the corner and a rusted stove that hadn't been used in years. The door was thick, reinforced with a metal latch on the outside. Whoever had put him here did not plan on returning soon. Footsteps crunched outside for a moment. Voices murmured, low and distant. Jack strained to listen, but the words were swallowed by the forest. Then the sounds faded, replaced by the night itself. Wind moved through the trees. Somewhere far off, an animal cried out. They were leaving him. Jack closed his eyes briefly and took slow, controlled breaths. He tested the ropes around his wrists with careful movements, feeling the texture and tension. They were plastic restraints, strong but not indestructible, too tight to break with brute force, especially in his condition. His phone was gone. His boots were still on, but his pockets had been emptied. They had done this efficiently, without anger. That frightened him more than shouting ever could. They expected him to die quietly. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Time lost its meaning in the dark. Jack shifted his position slightly, easing pressure off his shoulder and testing how much he could move without making noise. His back ached where he had been thrown down, but nothing felt broken. Pain was manageable. Fear was not allowed. He began examining the cabin inch by inch, using his feet and shoulders to feel the floor and walls. The boards beneath him were rough and uneven. As he rolled carefully onto his side, he felt something press against his bound hands. A nail, old and bent, protruding slightly from a loose plank. Jack's heart rate quickened, but he forced himself to slow down. Hope was dangerous if rushed. He adjusted his position by degrees, ignoring the fire in his muscles. Each movement scraped the plastic restraints lightly against the nail. The sound was barely audible, but in the silence it felt deafening. He paused often, listening for footsteps, for voices, for any sign that someone had returned. Nothing came except the wind. The restraints began to fray. It took a long time. His arms cramped. Sweat chilled his skin. At one point, he nearly lost control, biting down hard to keep from groaning as pain shot through his wrists. Finally, with one last careful pull, the plastic gave way with a soft snap. Jack froze, waiting for consequences. When none came, he slowly brought his arms around, massaging feeling back into his hands. His fingers trembled, stiff and clumsy, but they worked. He was free from the restraints, but not from danger. He stood unsteadily, testing his balance. His head swam, but his legs held. He moved to the back wall of the cabin, feeling along the boards until he found a narrow window, partially blocked by a loose plank nailed across it. The wood was rotten. With careful pressure, he eased it aside just enough to slip through. Cold air hit his face as he crawled out, boots scraping softly against dirt. He did not stand immediately. He stayed low, scanning the area, listening. The forest looked different at night, shapes blending together, distances impossible to judge, no lights, no voices. If guards were nearby, they were far enough not to hear his breathing. Jack moved. He kept to the shadows, avoiding open ground, letting the trees guide him. His body protested with every step, but he welcomed the pain. Pain meant he was alive. He did not know how far he had to go, only that he needed to reach a road or another human being before exhaustion claimed him. Hours passed as he walked, sometimes stumbling, sometimes stopping to steady himself against a tree. He followed the slope of the land downhill, trusting instinct and experience. Water meant civilization, roads, people. When his legs threatened to give out, he focused on small goals, 10 more steps, then 10 more. At some point near dawn, he heard an engine. The sound was faint at first, barely distinguishable from the wind, but it grew stronger. Jack pushed himself toward it, breaking through brush until he reached the edge of a narrow road. He stepped out just as a large pickup approached, headlights flaring. Jack raised his arms and nearly collapsed as the vehicle screeched to a stop. The driver, a middle-aged man with a worn jacket and wary eyes, jumped out. "Jesus," he said quietly. "What happened to you?" Jack opened his mouth to answer, but his voice came out rough and broken. "I need help," he managed. The man didn't ask questions then. He helped Jack into the truck and drove straight toward town. During the ride, Jack leaned his head against the window, watching the forest blur past, forcing himself to stay conscious. He knew that once he stopped moving, shock could take over. In town, the driver brought him to a small clinic. The staff asked questions, cleaned his cuts, checked his head. Jack answered what he could without giving details yet. He needed to think. He needed to choose his next move carefully. By mid-morning, wrapped in borrowed clothes and nursing a cup of coffee that steadied his hands, Jack sat alone on a bench outside the clinic. The sun was up now, the world going on as if nothing had happened. People walked past him, unaware that just hours earlier he had been left to die in the woods. He looked down at his scraped hands and bruised arms and made a decision. He could not handle this alone anymore. Those men were organized, wealthy, and confident that no one would challenge them. If he stayed silent, they would continue. If he tried to disappear, they would eventually find him or someone else would stumble into the same fate. What he had seen was too big, too deliberate to ignore. Jack stood, feeling steadier now, and headed toward the police station at the edge of town. Each step carried weight, not fear, but resolve. He had survived the night. Now he would make sure it mattered. As he reached the door, he glanced once toward the distant tree line beyond the buildings, where the forest still stood quiet and indifferent. Somewhere out there were the men who thought they had erased a problem. They were wrong. Jack told his story slowly and clearly. He did not embellish or speculate. He described what he had seen, where he had gone, and what had been done to him. The police officers listening to him exchanged glances more than once, their expressions shifting from routine professionalism to something sharper and more serious. When Jack mentioned the bunker and the recordings, the room grew quiet. He handed over the memory cards, the notebook, and the photographs he had taken at the camp. An officer left the room and returned with a supervisor. Then another call was made. Jack waited, his hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. Within hours, the story stopped being just his. State police secured the evidence, logging each item carefully. Wildlife officials were notified. By afternoon, federal agents arrived, asking precise questions about locations, times, and numbers of people involved. Jack answered everything he could, sometimes closing his eyes to picture the forest clearly, sometimes pausing to steady his voice when the memories pressed too close. The next day, reporters began calling. At first, it was local news. A small-town paper ran a short article about a former soldier uncovering illegal hunting activity near the reserve. By evening, larger outlets picked it up. The words changed slightly with each retelling, but the core remained the same. A hidden operation, protected land violated, and a man left for dead because he had seen too much. Jack did not seek attention, but he did not hide from it either. He understood something important now. Secrecy had protected the people who hurt him. Light was the only thing that would stop them. Law enforcement moved quickly once the story became public. Roadblocks appeared near the reserve. Helicopters circled openly this time, marked and unmistakable. Search teams swept through the forest, guided by Jack's descriptions and the data recovered from the bunker. The hidden camp was found, abandoned in haste but still filled with evidence. Weapons, vehicles, communication equipment, and documents tied names to dates and payments. Arrests followed. Security personnel were taken into custody first. Then the men who had paid for the hunts. Some tried to deny involvement. Others hired lawyers immediately. It did not matter. The evidence was overwhelming, and the public attention made quiet resolutions impossible. Charges ranged from illegal hunting and trespassing to kidnapping, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. As the investigation expanded, more stories surfaced. Ranchers from neighboring areas came forward, describing strange encounters, threats, and unexplained activity near their land. What had seemed isolated was revealed to be systematic. The reserve had been treated as a private playground by people who believed their money placed them above consequence. Jack watched much of this unfold from a distance. He returned to his house once the police confirmed it was safe, finding it unchanged but no longer peaceful in the way he had first imagined. News vans sometimes parked near the road. Strangers stopped him in town to shake his hand or thank him. The same diner that had fallen silent when he first walked in now buzzed with quiet pride when he entered. He accepted the attention politely but briefly. Praise made him uncomfortable. He had not set out to be a hero. He had only refused to look away. Court proceedings moved faster than anyone expected. The pressure of media coverage and the clarity of the evidence left little room for delay. Several defendants accepted plea deals. Others went to trial and lost. Sentences were handed down, harsh enough to send a clear message. The reserve was placed under increased protection, with new patrols and monitoring systems put in place to ensure nothing like this could happen again. One afternoon, weeks later, Jack stood at the edge of the forest near his home, watching officers remove the last remnants of the hidden bunker. The structure that had once held so much darkness collapsed inward as machinery tore it apart. When it was gone, the hillside looked ordinary again, just earth and trees, as if it had never hidden anything at all. The quiet returned slowly after that. The reporters left. The patrols became less visible. Life in town settled back into routine, though something had shifted beneath the surface. People spoke more openly now. Trust came easier. Jack felt it in the way neighbors greeted him, in the way his presence was no longer questioned. One evening, as the sun dropped behind the trees and the forest filled with soft, natural sound, Jack sat on his porch and listened. The stillness felt different now. It no longer pressed against him. It rested. He thought about why he had come here, about the exhaustion and distance he had carried with him. He had wanted to disappear. Instead, he had been found by a situation that demanded action. For the first time in a long while, he did not regret that. The land around him was safe again. The animals returned to paths that had gone silent. The forest reclaimed what had been taken from it. And Jack, once a stranger, now belonged to the place in a way he had not expected. He stayed, not because he was running from something anymore, but because he had found a reason to remain. The house in Montana was no longer just a retreat. It was home, built not on escape, but on the knowledge that even in the quietest places, doing the right thing could still matter. And this time, it had been enough. Comment where you're watching from, city or country. Subscribe and like for more stories ahead.